Jsem slyšet? Hello? No. Hello, good afternoon. Welcome here on a panel 4. It's called Safe Internet and How to Face Disinformation. It's my pleasure to be here with you all. My name is Daniel Galuška and I will be your host today. And what we are going to discuss. You all know that disinformation has become a phenomenon that is unwanted, but basically integral part of the internet world. How can we face it? National governments, the EU, non-governmental organizations all come up with many actions and strategies in order to tackle these fraudulent and abusive practices. However, are these truly effective? And what role should the education system play? Our guest today is the first one is from the Strategical Communication Department, Office of the Government Slovakia, Director Miroslava Saviris. Welcome. Second one is from non-governmental organization zvolsi.info, which basically means chooseyour.info. Ms. Kateřina Kempel. And the third one is also from Strategic Communication Department, this time from Office of Government from Czech Republic, Ms. Julie Matesová. Before we start, let me remind you that you all can ask questions through this application called Slido. There's a QR code, and in the end of this discussion, if we have some time left, we'll try to answer some of your questions. Please, every time, name a person you want to ask the question. Okay, and let's start. In the beginning, I believe that this discussion needs some theoretical background. So let me ask you, Kateřina, where does the freedom of speech end?
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. Freedom of speech ends when the security of some individual or some group safety is threatened. I can, for example, hate speech, urge to violent actions, violent comment, blackmailing, etc.
Thank you. Miroslava, do you want to add something? For example, what are the differences between freedom of speech and freedom of spreading lies in order to prevent the hostile goals of attackers?
Yes, this is obviously a very complex question. Thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to speak at this panel. As Kateřina said, obviously freedom of speech here in our European, domain is defined in our constitutions. It differs from the definition of the free speech, for example, from our US allies, where, speech is broader there defined than it is in our surroundings. So I think it's helpful always to distinguish between categories of speech which are illegal, let's say promotion of terrorism or hate speech, and disinformation, because disinformation is a phenomenon that is not new. It's been here forever, at least since humans started to develop modern or pre-modern societies. But when it comes to hate speech, that is clearly illegal. So when we speak about disinformation, that's not something that is illegal. And that's why solution to this issue or phenomenon that we currently have is so complex, because we do not want to sacrifice our freedom of speech, at the cost of, let's say, outlawing disinformation. That would probably be counterproductive.
Will you try to describe the term disinformation for us, please?
Sure. So typically disinformation is defined as incorrect information that is spread deliberately in order to confuse, manipulate, deceive, essentially. So it also differs from misinformation, which is incorrect information that is, however, spread without the intent to deceive. So again, it's helpful to distinguish between the categories as well.
Thank you. Now we know what the disinformation is, kind of. So let me ask, and let's start with Julia. Name an example of an accident caused by disinformation and explain how it shows a need to fight the disinformation back.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me on the panel. I would like to begin with a probably recent event, which was the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband and the discussion surrounding it, which has been focused on the attacker's connection to the disinformation scene in the US. However, I think that is a very concrete and not very usual accident, should we call it that, in regards to disinformation. I would say that's something we all here have in common, probably friends or family members who have become victims of disinformation. And I feel like the real issue here is are the relationships that are broken in regards to people falling victim to disinformation being so widely accessible through social media and other forms of communication.
Kateřina, do you want to add something? The mic is yours.
Thank you. I would like to add that what I experienced in our workshops is that almost all the time or every time there is someone who says that nothing is true. Truth doesn't exist. And this apathy or distrust to system, media, state, or maybe after some time, distrust to their colleagues, etc., is going to be a big problem. And the point of modern propaganda is not only to misinform or push some agenda, as Gary Kasparov said, it's also to exhaust critical thinking and to annihilate the truth. So what will be maybe after 10 years with our democracy if everybody believes that truth doesn't exist?
Thank you. And Miroslava, do you have some example of accident caused by disinformation?
Of course, I think we all could name plenty, but if I should mention the most recent one and very tragic from Slovakia, is a couple of weeks ago we had a young student turned into extremist who shot dead two people from the LGBTQI+ community in Slovakia because he believed, and he was radicalized online in foreign online communities, that essentially the world is governed by Jews, this typical Jewish conspiracy. By the way, in Slovakia, 52% of the population in Slovakia believe that Jews have too much power. So it's these insidious conspiracy theories, obviously combined with other factors. Now, I don't want to say it's just these, conspiracy theories that have radicalized him, no. But he clearly mentioned them and referred them in his manifesto that he has written prior to committing this awful act of terrorism. Another, perhaps funnier example, but certainly a costly one, is from the recent communal elections that we've had in Slovakia. There is this little town called Sliač, and there is a military airport base there, which was occupied during this totalitarian, times during communism by the Soviets. But within recent years, let's say 2-3 years, disinformation actors started to perpetrate this theory that the US airbase is planned there, and essentially the mayor of the town decided to have a referendum during the communal elections on whether people want US airbase at Sliač. Now, it doesn't matter that there were no such plans, that there are no such plans to have US airbase in Slovakia at Sliač. Nevertheless, this question was asked. 37% of the population in Sliač voted. Out of them, 75% said, no, we do not want US airbase at Sliač. There are two things interesting about this to me. First one is that the media interpreted this story as, and I now quote some headlines, people of Sliač refused American air bases in Slovakia at Sliač. If 37% of the population are voting, that's not the majority of population anyway. And to me, part of the problem, and I know I'm a government official and I shouldn't be criticizing, is also how media sometimes interpret this kind of basic information, because anybody who can count percentages can clearly say that this is not the majority. Another issue, obviously, that is linked to this is that the airport in question is not even part of the Sliač town, so the people literally don't have the right to decide this question at all. But people do not know that they do not have such right. So it clearly sort of links to ignorance as well. Obviously, this is funny now. There are so many jokes about this, but in the end, somebody has to sort of pay for it, because it's not a cheap thing to organize a referendum.
Thank you. It's funny and sad at the same moment. We all know, and you mentioned that one of the biggest problems is interpretation by media, and we all know that the best defense against interpretation of others is education, right? We have a decade of political promises all across the EU, mostly in the eastern part of EU, which included Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, and so on, that we will try to find some way how to educate young people to defend themselves in front of disinformations. But the fight is not won yet, and my question is for Kateřina this time. What are the biggest obstacles to actually delivering much needed changes in education, and how to execute them?
Well, Czech education system is struggling with the lack of teachers. We are missing around 8,000 teachers. And 60% of teachers were threatened by syndrome of burnout, and this number is before COVID, so nowadays I suppose it's higher. And last but not least, Czech education system is underfunded. Teachers are not adequately rewarded. So I would like to suppose some support for teachers. Even if you find active teacher who would like to spread media literacy, for example, in some special school, not classic gymnasiums, as we do have here, they are often facing misunderstanding from leadership of the schools. So they don't have any support or space to spread media literacy. What's more, we have freedom, schools have freedom in their curriculums how to fulfill media literacy. So it doesn't matter if the school has a subject or organizes a project day or invites an NGO for 1 or 2 hours, and they just check it that media literacy is done. It is crucial to reach as many people as possible, and that's why I find a solution in a long-term and across subjects attitude, because if you have only a seminar for one class, it doesn't fulfill the media literacy goal. So media literacy is also must be teach in actual context. If you teach nowadays students how media works, they doesn't really get it, or why should they? Because they are living on social medias and they need to know how algorithms on social media works, how to recognize manipulation, how to recognize if someone is playing with their emotions, etc.
Thank you. And it returns me back on a theoretical ground. I have a question let's start with Julia. Who should be the one who will evaluate which information is threatening the society or national security?
Thank you. I think that there should definitely not be one person. I'm sure we all understand the threat of that concentration of power. In regards to that, what I would personally imagine would be a group from multiple fields with a diverse, let's say, background, in order to ensure that if something like this will be established, or if something like this will be furthermore advanced within our government, that it does not threaten free speech as is defined in our laws.
Miroslava, do you want to add something?
Yes, I totally understand the trickiness of this question, but again, I think we need to circle back to whether we're talking about illegal content or whether we're talking about disinformation. Because if we're talking about disinformation, there you can employ a number of independent fact-checkers who are doing a great job in order to fact-check what is true and what is not. And that goes back to what Kateřina was saying, that, there's no such thing as non-existent truth as disinformation actors are trying to persuade us. There are facts and you can check them, and that's perfectly fine. If somebody is lying, they can lie. Nobody is going to put them in jail for lying. But if somebody is spreading hate or hate speech, that's something that already our law, I believe Czech Republic is very similar in this case to Slovakia, is clearly written, and those are the mantinels of free speech. And there you have courts which decide, whether this is a hate speech or not, or whether this content is illegal or not. And then you can, if you disagree with the rulings of the law, there are correctional procedures that you can resort to. I think it's a much bigger question of whether we actually apply the laws properly that we've got, whether we need new laws, but I wouldn't reduce this conversation to the fact that, now somebody will be, there will be this ministry of truth and they will be telling us what is right and what is wrong. No, this is simply not the case,
Thank you for this answer, because my another question is for all three of you, and it is if we should reconsider our criminal laws. Let's start with Julia.
I am going to keep this in regard to what we are discussing here, so I'll keep my answer short so the panelists can answer as well. I think that what's important is to make something that is future-proof in regards to law, that would control media or online content or illegal content in the cybersphere. And as such, the pace with which technology evolves currently, we see that the government is failing to adapt to it at a similar pace. And therefore, I think though we see platforms like Meta as the perpetrators of many of the disinformation issues, I think that they also have a unique experience with content moderating. And from personal discussions with content lawyers at Meta, I've come to believe that though we see them as the villains, they do have invaluable insight that states can use, especially because often they are much more ahead of the state's legislation internally regarding content moderation, and I think that is something very useful.
Miroslav, I've seen you nodding, so do you want to add something?
Yeah, as I previously stated, I think I'm not an expert on criminal law, but I already know that we do have criminal charges, as I mentioned, which prosecute extremism and hate speech. So the trouble is not really, at least in Slovakia's case, it's not really in how these laws are written, it's in how these laws are applied. And as Julia said, these technological changes and the progress at the pace at which these happen have outpaced what we as a government, as a state can do. So the trouble here is not with our laws, but with the fact that there's so much hate speech online that it's virtually impossible to cover it all. And I personally believe that one of the reasons why there's so much hate speech and extremism and radicalization online is because digital platforms such as Telegram or Meta are, they are operating this business model which essentially profits from these heightened emotions, but they are not giving us anything in return. And a small country such as Slovakia will never really have the resources to moderate all of this content. So for me, this should be a conversation about, how are we going to increase capacities? How are we going to train our forces in order to actually be able to discover hate speech online and do something about it? How are we going to take it to courts? Because in Slovakia, often judges are quite reluctant to prosecute hate speech online because they think it's not so serious as when it happens in the offline sphere, which to me is quite shocking, because we already know that hate speech online leads to physical violence. So to me, it's more about the application side of things.
Okay, thank you. This is interesting, though. Kateřina, what strategy do you propose to fight disinformation?
Well, it's obviously a society-wide problem. So, first of all, education. Not only in schools, but education of adults and seniors are necessary. The disinformation and conspiracy theories, they have audience in every target group, and you can find in elementary schools young pupils who believe in, I don't know, that the flat earth or something, and also your grandma believes that immigrants stole her money or something like that. So education, first of all, we need to solve this on EU level and cooperate with Meta and Telegram and Signal, etc. And also we need to find a way how to deal with structural problems like poverty, differences between regions in education, in living situation, and etc. And also it would be nice if state would have clear and comprehensible communication which eliminate the space of gray zone where conspiracy theories are created.
Okay, thank you. We have two women who do some strategic communication for a government, so I will let you answer these questions. What strategy do you propose? Let's start with Julia.
Thank you. I think that from where I stand and from my rather short currently participation in strategic communication, I think that what my colleague here is saying, that education is key, is very important. I understand that it is a long-term plan that supersedes politicians' terms, is not immediate in its effectiveness, and is not politically gratuitous, let's say. However, I think that there is truly just one form that we can do, and that is through education of all society. From our role as strategic communicators within the government, we can assist and help cooperate this effort, which we understand is very important, and help the fight against disinformation by engaging both non-governmental actors and government as well.
Miroslava?
Yes, I think the important things have already been mentioned, but I also think it's definitely whole of society approach, and that we should have the strategy where we, delineate the long-term goals, where we know the effect that we are going to see. It's going to be obvious in 5 or 10 years. In the meantime, what we can do is improve, in our, at least Slovakia's case, application of the criminal law to the online crimes that we can already prosecute. I genuinely believe that if we had some examples like that, disinformation actors would be not quite as brave to do what they're doing right now. But then we also need to regulate digital platforms. We know that the European Union has passed the Digital Services Act this year. It's a result of a 2-year-long process. And what it does is that it actually says that digital platforms, especially the very large online platforms, will be required to uphold national laws of the EU member states where they operate, which means that Facebook will no longer be able to say, I don't think this is hate speech, because if it is hate speech according to Slovak law, then they have to remove it. And if they don't do that, then they will be fined, And I genuinely believe that there needs to be, a bit of a stick as well. I have NGO background, now I work for state, but both of my experiences of working with digital platforms have been evasion, constant evasion, lack of cooperation, lack of investment into resources. Katarzyna mentioned, Julia, you said that essentially these digital platforms have a rich experience with content moderation. Yes, they do, but we would like to know about it because we know nothing about their content moderation practices. We don't even know how many content moderators does Facebook employ for Slovak media landscape or digital platform landscape. We know that there is one independent fact checker that Meta employs in Slovakia, one for our whole market, essentially. So I think, once we have these laws in place, then digital platforms will be kind of forced into investing much more resources into making their digital platforms secure, because states definitely cannot do it alone.
I just would like to add that it would help to fight disinformation if we, or state, strengthen the power of media, like quality journalism, and support them. And if disinformation channels would be somehow weakened, possibly through cut off the money flow, because disinformation websites reach money from advertisements. So if this would be solved, and I think it wouldn't be so slow process, it would be nice to have quickly. So that would also help this problem.
Thank you. And I would like to give a word to our audience. I've already received some questions, so I will start to read them. Okay, first questions. How do you balance dissemination of misinformation when social media algorithms intentionally exploit incendiary content to heighten engagement? Who wants to answer?
I think this goes back to what we have already mentioned about, we know nothing about how systems which digital platforms deploy operate. These are black boxes and nothing really forces them to share their systems operations with us. The research that we've got is from either independent research institutions, which, gather their data painstakingly, and anybody who has done any research on social media knows that getting data from digital platforms is not the easiest thing to obtain. Or it is done by whistleblowers, such as Francis Haugen, who tell us, about how these systems operate. So I think, again, I think the fact that Digital Services Act has passed is going to improve our knowledge of how these systems operate, because very large online platforms will be required to also conduct regular audits, which means once per year, for example, Meta or YouTube will have to conduct audit of their internal systems, and if there will be found any flaws, then they will be required to update these systems. They will also be required to share more data with digital services coordinators in each country. So I think a first step is more transparency. We need more knowledge in order to be able to answer the first question.
And what we can personally do is know about the social bubbles that we are living in. So, for example, if, and sometimes be aware of our social bubbles and sometimes go away and treat something else that we are comfort to, and also be aware that this is not a thing of Facebook and Instagram. For example, in TikTok, you can very fastly drop into a rabbit hole, and that means that if you are there and you are, for example, in depression, you will see, and you like this kind of videos, you will see only this type of content, and it will be more and more extremistic tendency. So, and it also it is also for the things from Ukraine crisis. When you are watching Ukraine soldiers, then it will be bombing of buildings and other violent content. So be aware and about this type of algorithms.
I would just like to expand on that a little bit. There's something each of you can do right now, and that is educate yourself against disinformation and about disinformation, because as the Bundestag says, protect yourself before helping others, as I like to call it, much like with a oxygen mask in an airplane. Make sure that you yourself don't succumb to disinformation, because there's the whole theory about fast brain, slow brain, and others, but I won't get into that. But there's online information easily accessible through NGOs that will guide you through a learning process into how to protect yourself and how to engage with others who have fallen for disinformation.
Thank you for your answers. We kind of open a topic of a war in Ukraine, right? And another question is, I think, especially for Julia and Miroslava. Let's start with Julia. Could you describe how significant is the impact of Russians' disinformation on the domestic environment in Czechia and Slovakia, and how you tackle it?
Thank you for the question. Let me begin by saying that the impact of disinformation is something we all see every day. For those who live in Czech Republic, we have seen that with recent demonstrations, which have aggravated another let's say, group of people. And I think that we, the state, understand that it is an issue. But we also understand that fighting against disinformation is a long-term project. We are currently at the beginning of the project, 3 months into it specifically. So we are just trying to get to know where we are at, what everybody else is doing, gathering inspiration, and making sure that if we ever, not ever, but if we do, and when we go forward with disinformation countering, we do it well, responsibly, ethically, and with long-term effects that will see the society as a whole flourish.
In Slovakia, we are slightly bit more disadvantaged than our Czech brothers towards Russian influence. It's interesting because both of our countries experienced the 1968 year and the Soviet occupation, yet people think that occupation from our US allies is somehow more likely than occupation from Russia, who is literally occupying our neighbor as we speak, a country which neighbors on Slovakia. You know, I remember 6 months ago when the invasion started, people were genuinely worried and were basically buying out iodine tablets and packing suitcases because we didn't know where they're going to stop. Those first 3 days were like, we didn't know. Bombs were falling not too far off from eastern regions of Slovakia. But people, you know, forget very quickly. But that's thanks to Russian influence operations that Slovakia has been experiencing at least since the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014. So I remember when this started, you know, and we've had these few weird outlets where people would be laughing at these conspiration outlets and the crazy stories that they were perpetrating. It was just like a few of these weirdos, you know, and people were laughing. But their influence and also the number of these outlets have substantially grown over the years. And I have to say that the state was not very active in countering these hybrid threats, because we're not talking about disinformation here solely. We're talking about hybrid threats that is essentially hostile actions of a state towards another state that are just under the radar of a observable threat. And this is something that we have been experiencing in Slovakia a long time ago, and it's been ongoing. It is the influence of, you know, Russian embassy in Slovakia. It is their activity on Facebook. In Slovakia, Russian embassy is extremely active on Facebook. They have very close, friendly relationships with a lot of political actors. Recently, we've had a demonstration of now what we can call extremist Smer SD party in, you know, somewhere in Zvolen, and they invited the ambassador Bratchikov there to speak. We have our prosecutor general amplifying disinformation of Russian origin. So yes, Russian disinformation is flooding Slovak information space, but there are plenty of internal actors who actually participate in it. And if they didn't participate, these actions wouldn't be so successful. So from this perspective, the invasion of Ukraine has been a wake-up call also for the government, because I think everybody realized that this threat is much more serious than just spewing a few lies here and there online.
Thank you. Then another question will be kind of similar. You've been asked about the accidents caused by disinformation, right? Could you recall such incident caused by Russian disinformation? You just kind of did, but if you have another one, maybe you start with you, Julia.
I think that is a very tricky question for Czech Republic, which I'm not sure I feel comfortable answering to its full extent. But what we have facts about are, for example, the organizers behind the most recent let's say, protest movements which happened in Prague, which have been directly linked to the disinformation scene. And we can see what kind of power they can acquire in a rather very short amount of time, especially using strong emotions, as was mentioned, in connection to Ukraine and Russia's invasion there, and the worsening of the energy crisis and the hiking of prices, which is happening across different fields, from produce to, as I said, gas and electricity.
Maybe I will add some answer by myself. When Ukraine war started, I was amongst people in Bohumín railway station. Bohumín is actually a city which is located in the borders with Poland. It's obviously a big railway station. And so all the refugees who were fleeing to Czech Republic, they stopped there for some amount of hours, and a lot of volunteers from Bohumín actually came and helped them. We saw that there are elderly people, lots of women with children, just a few of men. Few weeks after, the very same people who were volunteers there and helped the refugees were the same people who start to be aggressive and started to repeat the narrative that amongst the refugees there are solitary men who are rich, who escaped Ukraine because of income from social insurance in the Czech Republic, and this I think demonstrate the power of Russian disinformation, because those people, there were no people from different cities who didn't see a refugee from a train. They were actually volunteers who experienced the crisis on themselves, and few weeks after they completely changed. So the propaganda is really strong.
If I may give you another interesting case study of Russian disinformation, is that perhaps a month ago or month and a half ago, I'm sure you all remember when mass graves of civilians and soldiers were discovered in Izium as a result of Russian war crimes. What happened at the same time in Slovakia is that Russian embassy posted this story on Facebook where they claimed that there is a cemetery in Ladomírova where the mayor of this little village decided to basically bulldoze this cemetery, destroy this cemetery of alleged Soviet soldiers. So this enraged the whole information space. This mayor started receiving death threats, literal death threats. And what happened there was, first of all, there's no Soviet cemetery in Ladomírova at all. There is a cemetery where there are soldiers from the First World War. Some of them are Soviet. What the mayor did was some reparatory work in order to literally improve the pavements around the cemetery. But the Russian embassy made this into a disinformation story, which essentially covered the Izium story. So it's always good when you search for or try to see through the Russian propaganda, you always have to ask yourself, what is their end game, you know? Of course, it is to confuse the Slovak population. Of course, it is to enrage local hostilities. But first and foremost, they didn't want another story about mass graves, as a result of Russian occupation in Ukraine to be essentially trending on social media. And they succeeded, unfortunately.
Thank you. Now the question for the Czech and Slovakian Stratcoms. Could you please elaborate and assess the ways or mechanism or approaches of dealing with disinformation within NATO and EU from your national perspectives?
Well, I have to say that I think that EU and NATO are quite new to this game, as well as we are. Obviously, they are starting to communicate more with citizens, essentially, which is great. But they have teams. The European Union has the EEAS team, but that was Stratcom directed mostly at its external action service, so mostly at audiences outside of the EU. But I think that recently they have realized that, gosh, we have a problem at home. Perhaps we should communicate with our own citizens as well. So our activities tie together in a way that we are trying to cooperate with them, obviously, because I think Katerina said that essentially if you have this information vacuum where people don't know what European Union is, people don't know how it functions, people don't know what is NATO, people don't know what it's supposed to do, people don't know the difference between government office and government often. So it is exploiting these essentially blank spaces which need to be filled with facts. So right now we have this multinational battle group in Slovakia, which is actually led by Czech delegation, and they are doing some information activities both in the region as well as online, trying to inform people if they are interested about what this presence means for Slovakia. Also informing them more about, as a NATO, informing more our citizens about our own soldiers that are serving missions in different countries. So it's just about, just getting more information to the people. I think it still can be improved in the tone of voice. I think more can be done in the frequency and in the way these communication campaigns are executed, but it's good that we have started.
I would like to perhaps be a bit more specific in regards to what we are currently doing as strategic communication of the Office of the Government. We are excited with what the EU and NATO are doing, but we at the same time understand that Czech Republic has a specific mindset in regards to the perception of information that is given out by the government, that is connected to our history, and that is, we can say, a certain deficiency which has not been solved by the state. And there have been previous attempts that we have witnessed during COVID, which were not as successful. Therefore, we see that the inspiration we can get from EU and NATO and apply it to our very specific and a little bit unique little country is very useful to us. We are currently preparing an action plan, and that includes a lot of what Katerina has been talking about and what EU and NATO are trying to do on a wider scale, while we also try to narrow it down so that it really is effective for Czech citizens.
Thank you. And another question returns us a bit on the beginning. Some may argue that prosecuting people because of their comments online violates free speech and only deals with consequences. How would you counter this? Kateřina?
I'm not sure if I understand correctly the question. Could you please rephrase it? Okay. I think it's a tricky question, but first of all, I think that we need to work on strengthening national values or goals to build a trust in a system like democracy, that the living in democracy is a fine way to live. It's better than live in a totality kind of state. So I think that would be nice to have in the first place. And well, I don't think that criminalizing violent comments is threatening the hate speech. I think it needs to be communicated well. Why it causing harm to another group of people, etc.
If I may just add to that, I mean, somebody's personal freedom to say whatever they want to say ends where it harms another person. So, I mean, if somebody is receiving death threats online, even in the form of a comment, why shouldn't it be taken seriously? I mean, what's the difference between sending it via post? And if you send it via post, then it's a criminal offense. So it is a criminal offense if you post it in the form of a comment online. And I think people, what's missing here is a concept of digital citizenship, because our citizenship, it doesn't apply only in the offline world. Our world is changing. It is digital. It will be more digital in the future than it is now. So we need to start to understand, as Katarzyna said, some set of values that apply in both of these worlds as these worlds are merging. And it's a sort of return to a basic ethics and a basic sort of morals, that it's just not polite to actually swear and insult people online in a public sphere. It just shouldn't be accepted.
Thank you. Another question from the audience is, how can society support third-party independent fact-checkers in our region?
I think that if you are a member of society, there are numerous options where you can volunteer to help the fight against disinformation, especially in the Czech Republic. So I think not only that, then can you actively volunteer, but actively, as I already mentioned, educating yourself is an immense help, though it does seem like it is on a very small scale. Do not underestimate that.
What about funding third parties organizations which are not governmental?
That is something we are discussing right now within the development of our action plan, and we understand that it is important to support not only independent fact checkers, because debunking goes only a certain way, but engaging a whole spectrum of non-governmental organizations that are helping the fight against disinformation. And I think it is the role of the government and the state to help, but at the same time it needs to be done in an ethically and morally understandable manner.
And where should we find money for funding non-governmental fact-checkers? What do you think? Special tax, maybe? No?
That is an awesome question, and especially that the Czech Republic is now discussing its next, well...
I'm going to have an out-of-the-box idea. We can tax large digital platforms and invest the money into independent fact-checking and support of the media, But I know that's out there, just saying.
It was just brainstorming, right? Okay, and next question. What way do you think is the most effective for communicating with people who believe disinformation? Often they don't accept facts and just repeat their truth, so-called truth.
Well, with respect and understanding, ethically, maybe find something out about their kind of way thinking about some problem, because if you know something about the context, for example, of flat Earth, conspiracy theory, that you would be able to reach simpler the opponent, if I say, and maybe ask some questions and listen more than talk. Like, you have 2 years, use them they will talk it out, and maybe after some time you can talk and discuss with them, but with respect and understanding, and be kind of friend and not get upset or angry. It doesn't work. It would backfire in a minute, in a second.
I would just like to, on a personal level, say thank you for that, because we were discussing this within our office, and we all arrived at the same conclusion that we would react aggressively against a person who will be actively sharing disinformation. We would try to argue with them, shout at them. That is your initial emotional response. So this is very important, and thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, and I think if you arrive at a point where you know that your close one, I think we all have, somebody like that in our space, I think it's important to try and have conversations about the things that you share, and perhaps don't go into those very hostile conversations if you know that it's actually not going to help. Because I think what the crazy times that we live in is actually the level of frustration and anger and polarization is constantly growing, and I think we all can just try and be more calm and try to keep these friends and family in your circle and not alienate each other because you divide on these, I understand, very, very important issues. And I know it's easier when we say it here than it's done in practice. But I would like to just say one more word about what Katarzyna was mentioning at the beginning of this panel, because I think she mentioned something super important, and that's trust in institutions. I think nobody is going to win information war by persuading the other side that they are wrong and that they should change their opinion. That's simply not going to work. And also that's why strategic communications, it's not about debunking or fact-checking. It may be part of communication, but debunking existing disinformation is not going to help, because it's not going to help increase the trust in institutions. So I believe the winning strategy is much more difficult than that. We actually have to, as a state, create good policies for citizens, and then we need to be able to clearly communicate these policies to the citizens so that the level of mistrust decreases. Because if you look at some of the countries, such as, Finland or Estonia, countries which have the best education systems in the world by far, the level of their susceptibility to disinformation is much smaller. But these countries also have relatively high trust in state institutions and also intrapersonal trust.
Thank you for your answers. And another question is, how do Czech and Slovakian Stratcom departments view Chinese social media apps? Are they an imminent threat in misinformation and disinformation practices in our countries? I would say from my personal experience, they are.
Yes, unfortunately in Slovakia this conversation, always whenever there is an external threat, we are just like last ones to realize that there's a threat or something. But I think experts at the government realize that this is an issue. I don't think enough has been done about it. I think Czech Republic in this respect has much more higher level of awareness. In Slovakia, people do not even consider China as a threat, and I believe we have like a third of population, if not more, who think that Chinese model of state governance should be an inspiration to us. So I think we have a task to do, which is, I'm just taking a mental note, that we need to start inform our citizens about what's going on in China and their impact around the world as well, much more known.
I think we see the dangers which come with social media platforms from China. and we are actively during our monitoring and analysis seeing an uptick in TikTok disinformation check videos. So I think it is becoming a problem that we have been monitoring for quite a while, but we are hoping to use this as a platform from which we can alert to the entire social media sphere as and the issues it represents.
I will try to expand these questions to Kateřina as well. You are visiting schools and you are trying to educate them how to move in the digital environment, right? Do you have some specific strategies how to explain threats on TikTok, for example?
Well, I'm not really a TikTok user, so I'm kind of old for this stuff, unfortunately. Well, I think it, as I already mentioned, it is important to know how TikTok or social media in natural works, that there are some algorithms which are trying to catch an attention of every user and persuade him to spend there as much time as it's possible through automatically playing videos or stories or reactions, because long time ago there wasn't any like button on a Facebook. Nowadays we have 5. The content without an end on TikTok, this is also a kind of way how to be there. Well, some of the students said that they are able to be on TikTok 10 hours per day. So we are trying to show them some red flags, how to distinguish between content and harmful content, and we are trying to more to show them how social networks are based on what kind of principles they are based on, and also we are trying to show them that it's not just a fault of social networks. We as a people and our brain have also some faults, and we are showing them how cognitive biases are working and how to deal with confirmation biases and etc.
Thank you very much. Another question is once again to Miroslava and Julia. What are your governments doing to support resilience and media literacy in Eastern Partnership countries?
Wow, that's a good question. I'm not sure I can answer this question because that's not area of my expertise, and I don't want to say that we are not doing something because we may be doing something. So I don't think I'm qualified to answer this question. Sorry.
I would unfortunately like to follow up with a similar answer. I would like to expand on the fact that we understand the issue, and as I already mentioned, we are only in the emerging stage of this fight, so unfortunately I can't expand on that either.
Okay, we can't answer everything, right? Anyway, Czechia deals with a specific problem, and that is chain mails spreading disinformation, right? How dangerous is this phenomena compared to disinformation on social media? Let's start with Kateřina, I would say.
Well, I think chain mails aren't so cool as it used to be. It moves to WhatsApp and Telegram channels. So when it was only on mails, the reach was high, but on WhatsApp and Telegram, the reach is higher, in my opinion. And because When you are spreading chain mails, you have to be active in it. But if you are just a member of some group, you just receive it and you don't need to co-work on this spreading of disinformation.
Of course, Czechia deals with a specific problem, chain email spreading disinformation. How dangerous is this phenomena compared to disinformation on social media?
Okay, I think that there is a surprising new trend in chain emails, and that is political engagement within them and the shift in their content. There definitely has been a shift to WhatsApp and Telegram. I personally receive multiple messages from a friend daily through WhatsApp regarding this, and I do keep it as kind of a bubble bursting chat so that I am up to date on what's happening. I think that chain emails represent, especially for the older generation who is used to email as probably the most current form of communication, still an issue. But there are non-governmental organizations such as Elpida, which are working with seniors to inform them about the threats that come from such emails and to build up their resilience to disinformation. So I think that is hopefully answering your question at least a little bit.
I would personally maybe add something. A few years ago, the chain mails were really an issue because on a social media you can see all the content. Maybe you can't see everything because something is in a secret groups on social media, but pretty much everything is visible. But chain mails were really under the ground, right? But we defend ourselves, or not defend, we try, we found a way how to monitor them, and that was once again through non-governmental organization or maybe movement, which is called Check Else. The name Else is because they are fighting against trolls on internet, and they became part of these mail chains, and today they have a really thick database of chain mails and so on, and Czech Else are very willing to cooperate with government, so we exchange information and monitoring and everything. So I think, in my personal opinion, right now we are able to monitor chain mails as good as social media. Next question is, should media literacy courses be taught in elementary schools? If Finnish model is so successful, why is it not implemented more widely?
Because it's not cheap, I would say. It's always a matter of capacities. I know that especially after a terrorist attack in Slovakia, more attention is being paid to how can we make sure that kids at school are receiving not only media literacy education, but also that they are, mentally, psychologically okay, because it's obviously a matter of radicalization and also some mental issues. In Slovakia, I know that Ministry of Education is preparing an educational reform, and part of it is also a so-called global education strategy, a concept essentially which I would describe it as something as citizen education 2.0, so that kids not only receive digital media literacy education, but also understand the complexity of our world in nuances, because a lot of problems that we're facing right now actually comes from our inability to accept the fast-paced changes that our world is going through. So we actually need our kids to be more resilient in this respect, so that we don't see everything, just in black and white terms. So I know that the Ministry of Education is preparing this, and we are also cooperating with them. So these are some of the, examples of a good cooperation, but it's just matters of first steps. In Slovakia, why we don't have education like Finland does, because Finland is one of the most, progressive and successful countries in the world. Finland does not have the experience with totalitarian regimes. We have two. We had like Slovak fascist state, followed by decades of communism. Our education suffers from this. My niece still learns in a way that I used to learn, 15 years ago, and that educational system still carries a lot of remnants from that totalitarian system, where whatever is written on the blackboard, you need to memorize it, and that's it. There's no work with different sources of information, the need to integrate that information, the need to evaluate that information. I remember literally, we were being taught, poems where teacher would say, what is your interpretation of this poem? And it would be like, well, that's incorrect. How can interpretation of an art be incorrect? So it's just things like that still need to change, and that change is going to take a lot of money, a lot of capacities, and a lot of time. And the last thing, I don't want to speak for much too long, but we have a problem also, which Katerina mentioned. Teachers are not paid enough. Also, choosing teaching as a profession is literally the last thing anybody studying at university will choose. It's like the last option that you've got. We have teachers that recommend disinformation outlets to their pupils. So one of the places where children can pick up disinformation sources is actually school, and when teacher recommends it to you, then why wouldn't you trust it? So it's also about teaching teachers as well, but first we also need to pay them well. So it's one large, massive issue.
Yeah, I would just like to underline that, and we are missing around 8,000 of teachers. Teachers are overwhelmed, and it takes a lot of effort to come up with something new. If you are a burnout teacher in a middle school where students are, they are not behaving nicely to you, why should you even try? On the other hand, I know that in Czech Republic there are a lot of schools and a lot of teachers who go further and who are not only teaching media literacy, but also analytic thinking and critical thinking, etc. And these things are happening on elementary schools. So the differences between schools are huge, not only between regions, but also in the region. You have great school, for example, somewhere, and in another city, it's zero level. So we need also work on these differences.
Julia, should we teach pupils something about media literacy in elementary school?
I'm not an educational expert, nor do I have the background for that, but my personal opinion is yes. I myself was shortly part of an educational system that did so, and I can say it was only to our advantage. It is not something that I feel parents are very apprehensive towards this. There can be some negative emotions regarding you are teaching our children what to think and those narratives that are repeated often. But I think that done well, and it can be, and it has been, it is an immense asset to begin at such a young age, especially with the access to information that is so now widely
Thank you. And I believe we have a time for a very last question, which is due to the current geopolitical climate, should we increase our focus on the spread of disinformation in the global?
I hope I understand the question correctly. I mean, should we focus on the fact that outside of the EU or let's say our Western sphere, disinformation propagated by other external actors is actually affecting our international relations? Is that the way the question has been framed? Yeah, well, of course, it would be great. That's, you know, in a way, at the European level, that's how strategic communication started. It was a reaction to disinformation being spread about the EU outside of the EU. It's a great thing. I know that our Ministry of Foreign Affairs is trying to do that as well. I think having, you know, embassies in these countries and having engaged ambassadors is obviously a great way to communicate with local populations, unless you do it like the Russians, that you join political protests in the middle of towns. I wouldn't recommend that. So yes, definitely. But again, it all takes capacities and financial resources.
Okay, that was quick. So maybe one more question in the end. Can you expand on media literacy education of elderly or socially excluded parts of population, and what strategy could work there? That's maybe for Kateřina, I believe. Or Julia, you can start.
Yeah, no, you can. You already took the
Okay. I will just speak from our personal experience in regards to the state's communication with the older generation, and that there are many gaps, perhaps even a lacuna that the state is not aware of. And it goes to such little things as the font that is used in printouts for seniors, and also in the method of communication, where a website, which is currently very often used as the form of communication state to citizen, is not always accessible to everybody, and that needs to be kept in mind.
I would suggest that the way how to reach extend social groups is through local subjects. It cannot be. It can't go from up to down. Yeah, it wouldn't work. So maybe some library could organize some event, and or Elpida can come, and it has to be. The project should be long-term, because persuasions there are very, very strong. So it can be just for one event, and it has to be prepared for needs of target group. Because when you are living in one room with 3 or 4 children, you don't really care about media literacy. You literally don't care. So maybe more focus to those needs, and then media literacy would be nice.
Okay, thank you all for your answers. And thank you in the audience for joining us and having us today. Our today guests were Miroslava Saveris, Kateřina Kimpl, and Julia Matesová. Thank you all. And let me give you one final note. I would like to invite you to main hall, where there will be closing remarks. Thank you all once again, and have a nice day.